Coming up today on the Nick Craig Show, Vice President JD Vance appearing on the very popular Joe Rogan podcast. Plus, we'll take you to Washington, D.C. as the nomination for Todd Blanche continues. All those details and more coming up. And a good Thursday morning to you. Welcome into the Nick Craig Show, streaming live this morning on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Facebook. Don't forget that you can take the show with you 24/7 on demand. It's real easy, simple, and totally free to do. Just head on over to your favorite podcast app, search for the Nick Craig Show, or visit the website nickcraig.com. Our program this morning brought to you by the Law Group here in Wilmington. Visit them online, lawgroupnc.com. You can also get access to our daily show notes by visiting patreon.com/Nick Craig. One of the things that I talk about in great detail on this program is trying to truly understand what elections are all about. On yesterday's program, we talked about the very important United States Senate race taking place here in the state of North Carolina. It pits former Democrat Governor Roy Cooper against the former head of the Republican National Committee, Michael Whatley, former head of the North Carolina Republican Party as well, in a high-stakes Senate match that is going to take place and is already taking place here in the state of North Carolina. And one of the things we talked about is looking at some of the political polling and seeing very clearly that people generally in North Carolina have a good opinion on Roy Cooper. And I detailed some of the reasons why that's the case. Obviously, it is due in large part to our left-wing media that refuses to cover a lot of this. That's a major problem. On the other side, this is something that is a larger political discussion. The vast majority of the American people, and I wish things were different, I really do, but they're not. The vast majority of the American people are not heavily engaged in politics. Now, this does not mean that they are completely ignorant of what's going on. I'm not saying that the vast majority of people have no clue, but the vast majority are not involved in politics day in and day out like I am and like many of you are. We are the 1% of this stuff. We are hyper engaged, hyper involved. We can rattle off stats and figures and numbers and all of that stuff, which is a good thing, right? There's nothing bad with that. But that is not the vast majority of people. I wish it were. I wish as an American society, we had an electorate that was much more engaged and much more involved in the process of what's going on. But I get it. People are busy. They're busting their rear end day in and day out at their job. They're dealing with their children's after school sports and all the extracurriculars and things of that nature. And at the end of the day, when all of that is done, dinner wraps up at the end of the night and you've got an hour or two to unwind and relax, the vast majority of people don't want to spend that time digging into politics. They want to unwind, want to watch something on TV, scroll on their phone for a little while, and just disconnect a little bit from reality. That is a totally normal thing. And that's where the vast majority of people, I think, are, which explains why when you ask individuals about things that have gone on, relatively large issues, and they have no clue, that's why, because they're not heavily engaged. One of the things that we saw play out very well for the Trump campaign in the 2024 election cycle was the usage of alternative media. Right? It's one thing for a politician, and for those that are cable news watchers, politicians go on Fox and CNN and MS Now, whatever it's called. They go on CBS and ABC and NBC and all of these other shows. And that's great for the individuals that watch those programs. That's great for the smaller percentage of people that are heavily invested and heavily engaged in this stuff. And that's good. You need to do that. You need to talk to those analysts, you need to talk to those hosts, and you need to talk to those audiences. No question about it. But the Trump campaign in 2024 implemented a strategy that was very unique and one that I think paid major dividends for them as we approached November of 2024. The president and the vice president, who neither were in that position at the time, went on a variety of new media platforms. Went on with live streamers, sitting down with the podcast hosts, and talking on shows that are inherently not very political. Meeting an audience of people that care, I'm sure, but are not super heavily invested. And this has continued throughout the administration. We're now a little more than a year and a half into the Trump-Vance term, with them in the White House, them in the West Wing of the White House in Washington, D.C. And I am so glad to see that strategy is continuing. On yesterday's episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, which by all accounts is the most popular podcast in the world, Joe Rogan sat down with Vice President JD Vance, who is currently on a book tour, which no surprise, when you're on a book tour, you go on all of these shows. And while there was a little bit of discussion on the book itself, a little bit of promotion on the book right near the end of the more than 2 hour and 50-minute episode, for 2 hours and 50 minutes, Joe Rogan, which I get is not everybody's cup of tea, but what I can say very clearly is it is the most popular podcast, at least in the United States and maybe across the world, receiving tens of millions of downloads a week through all of the various platforms that it's available on, sitting down with the vice president. We saw Donald Trump sit down with Joe Rogan during the presidential campaign. Kamala Harris was offered and given the same opportunity to do so. She chose not to do it. She requested that Joe Rogan, who has his studios in Austin, Texas, travel to Philadelphia, or I think it was Philadelphia, essentially construct and build a makeshift studio, and she would talk to him for anywhere between 45 minutes and an hour. Now, I'm a longtime Joe Rogan listener. That's not the format of the show. I couldn't tell you the last time. I don't know that there's ever been in recent years a 45-minute to an hour-long episode of the Joe Rogan Experience. It is a podcast that regularly runs 2.5, 3, sometimes even 3.5 hours. It is a lengthy one-on-one, one-on-two, sit-down, casual interview show for those that have watched it. And it is a very influential platform. And so when JD Vance, who is the current sitting vice president of the United States, appears on a program like that, it is a major deal. It is something that shatters all sorts of historical norms in politics. And it's a very good strategy. One of the things for those that are involved in politics on the inside, campaigns and party operations, one of the things that you will constantly hear, and something I agree with wholeheartedly, is you have to meet voters, or you have to meet people where they are. And you think about that, right? You're trying to convince people, if you're a Republican or conservative, to show up and vote for your Republican or conservative candidates. If you're a Democrat, you're trying to do the same thing, but with a Democrat and liberal candidates. And it's because so many people are not engaged, it is pivotally important to meet people where they are. You can't force them to come to you, so you go to where they are. And that is the relevance, that is the importance of high-ranking administration officials like the vice president, like the president, who have both appeared on this show. I think JD Vance has been on, this is maybe his third or fourth time being on Joe Rogan's show. You are meeting people where they are. There is a lot of I would argue the vast majority of the listeners of the Joe Rogan podcast are not hyper-engaged, hyper-involved political people. And so when the vice president of the United States sits down with Joe Rogan for nearly 3 hours, you are meeting an audience of people that you would not have had the ability to talk to, because they're not turning on Fox. They're not turning on CBS. They're not turning on CNN. They're listening to Joe Rogan and other sorts of new podcasts and new media, and you are meeting those voters, meeting those people where they are. And it was masterfully done by Vice President JD Vance on Joe Rogan this week. Absolutely masterfully done. I binged the entire thing yesterday, came out yesterday afternoon, and listened to the entirety of it, the almost 3 hours of it throughout the day yesterday. And it was a phenomenal interview. Absolutely phenomenal interview. We are talking about Vice President JD Vance sitting down with the world's most famous, most well-known podcaster, that being Joe Rogan and the Joe Rogan Experience, a lengthy 2 hour and 53-minute sit-down with Joe Rogan on his podcast yesterday. And the premise that I bring to you on the program today is this is what needs to continue to happen. The administration and the administration surrogates and people that are closely aligned with the president, in this case, you're talking about the number two man and the vice president, need to continue a strategy that they implemented in 2024, which was showing up on these non-traditional, non-typical forms of media. Joe Rogan does not have a television show. He does not have a television channel. He does not own a radio station or a radio show. He has a very well-built studio out in Austin, Texas. He sits down with individuals and conducts a very casual one-on-one, one-on-two interview show. And Joe Rogan isn't everybody's favorite thing. I get that. Not everybody loves him. Not everybody enjoys listening to him. That's fine. This is not to say here and say, Joe Rogan is the best podcast that has ever existed. That's not my point. This is a show that reaches tens of millions of people each and every week. A new show, 2 to 3 hour show coming out every single weekday, 5 days a week, a new episode of this show dropping with millions of listeners per episode per week. Tens of millions of people tuning into this program. And so when the Vice President of the United States sits down and has a very real and frank conversation, that's one of the things that makes Joe Rogan's podcast, I think, so popular and such an interesting listen to for so many people. It is as casual as a conversation as you can imagine. Often, obviously not with the vice president, but often during the conversations, and Joe gets a lot of flack for this from some individuals. They're drinking, they're in Texas, they're in Austin, smoking a little weed. It's a very casual conversation. And that is something that has driven so many people towards this show. It is like you are sitting in to, and not scripted, nobody's sitting in front of a teleprompter. There's not a bunch of producers behind the scene holding up cue cards as to what questions to ask, what questions to say. And it's that casual nature, it's that casual conversation that draws so many people in. And this interview was all over the map. They talked about disclosure as it relates to UFO and aliens. There was discussions about the Jeffrey Epstein and the Epstein files, discussions about voter fraud in the state of California, the city of Los Angeles, which Joe Rogan used to call home. JD Vance's wife, which I didn't realize, grew up in the San Diego area, so there's a Southern California connection there, and a lot of discussion about the ongoing conflict in Iran. Conversations and topics that you don't get when the vice president sits down on cable news or goes and does a short form interview with one of the major television networks, ABC, NBC, or CBS. Those are typically 15 to 20 minutes. They're very scripted. There's a lot of gotcha questions. This wasn't really, and they didn't agree on everything, which was great. And one of the things that I think makes Joe Rogan's program so interesting is that there wasn't this, oh, I'm out to get you or you're out to get me. No, it's just a casual conversation. There was a pretty lengthy discussion about whether it's appropriate for states like Texas to put the 10 Commandments in the public school system. JD Vance and Joe Rogan had a full-throated argument on that, disagreed, but talked through it, with Joe Rogan saying, yeah, I can understand what you're saying that, but I think this way, with JD Vance saying the same thing. That's a good point, Joe. I can understand where you're coming from there, but I see it a little bit differently. And it's that kind of casual conversation that I think has become, it almost has seemingly evaporated from the current political sphere, where these conversations just don't happen. And to elaborate on some of this and to give you an example of what I'm talking about, there was some discussion on the procedural rules within the United States Senate. Obviously, the SAVE Act remains a hot topic of conversation. It has been stalled in the United States Senate under the control of John Thune now for months. So JD Vance and Joe Rogan talked about that in a very casual way. Take a listen.
Federal thing. So we are right now trying to pass the Save America Act. One of its main provisions is a requirement that you do voter ID. And we actually have, I think, a majority of the Senate that would support it. But this is just weird Senate procedural bullshit. There is a subsegment of people who want voter ID but won't blow up the filibuster in order to achieve it. And so they're so married to these old world Senate procedures that they're going to make it impossible for us to pass Save America. Now, we are, for what it's worth, trying to fix that and trying to address these like weird procedural archaic things. It's insane, though. Like, if you ever, okay, I'm sure you hear people talk about the filibuster all the time.
Yeah.
I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole. Here's what the filibuster is. It is a pure Senate rule. It is a creation of the Senate procedures, which basically says that anything that has to do with the budget is a 50-vote threshold. And everything else, non-budgetary, is a 60-vote threshold. Now, as you can imagine, there's some gray area on things that maybe count as budget issues and should be 50, or are not budget issues and count at 60. So what we have tried to persuade the Senate to do is to treat the voter ID as something that can fall within the 50-vote threshold. And there is no law, there's no provision in the Constitution. It is legitimately that there are senators who are so attached to the idea that budget is 50, non-budget is 60, that they're quite literally willing to prevent voter ID in America.
And so there's the little bit of the back and forth, a little bit of profanity laced in there. Again, a casual conversation taking place on this podcast where JD Vance lays out the issue. There's nothing in the United States Constitution. There's no statute that exists within the federal government that requires the Senate to operate in the way that it is. It is simply procedural. That is the kind of real casual conversation that the non-super engaged political folks in the United States, which I will contend is the vast majority of people, can understand, can resonate with. JD Vance lays it out as plainly as possible. They're married to these old world Senate procedures, making it impossible for us to pass the SAVE Act. That is not a kind of conversation that you get when somebody like JD Vance or President Trump appears on cable news or on the big networks. And that's why, regardless of whether you like Joe Rogan, regardless of whether you like JD Vance, there's plenty of Republicans that do not like JD, spent all day yesterday going after him on social media. What a buffoon, what a disgrace to the vice president's office that he would go on this show and talk about these issues in this way. This is how you win. And why do I say that? What gives me confidence to make that statement? We saw it in 2024. While the Democrats, including Kamala Harris, ran away from these new media platforms because they were incapable of having these legitimate casual conversations, Donald Trump, JD Vance, and the campaign embraced it. And I think in large part, that is one of the reasons that Donald Trump and JD Vance had such a successful election night in November of 2024. I truly believe that that's the case. Sitting down and meeting listeners, meeting voters, meeting an audience where they're at is pivotally important. It cannot be understated how impactful this stuff is. Now, do I know exactly what the breakdown of the Joe Rogan audience is? No, I do not. But I would suspect, and I know this firsthand from friends that I have, people that I know that are not hyper-political. Some of them do not even vote. They are avid Joe Rogan listeners. They're not hyper-engaged. These people don't even vote. Now, it's not to say that they're completely blind, but they're just not interested. It's not everybody's cup of tea. They don't, for whatever reason, they choose not to. That's their right to do so in America. Nobody forces you to go out and vote. But that is an individual that listens to somebody like Joe Rogan on a pretty regular basis that will hear or has already heard a 3-hour conversation with the Vice President of the United States that otherwise would never have been heard, would never have been pondered, would never have been talked about, because these individuals don't watch the news. They don't watch Fox News. They don't watch CNN. They don't watch the evening news programs. They don't watch 60 Minutes or any of these on CBS Sunday mornings or Meet the Press. They don't watch any, literally consume zero of that content. But they listen to somebody like Joe Rogan, who did a 3-hour sit down with the Vice President of the United States. I've got a couple more clips from this coming up. Plus, we'll try and get to Washington, D.C. and Todd Blanche. All of this ahead of a primetime address coming up at 9 p.m. tonight. President Donald Trump is set to discuss election integrity coming up at 9 p.m. He'll be addressing the nation. I'll be watching that, and we'll, of course, have that coverage for you coming up tomorrow morning right here on the Nick Craig Show. We'll grab a quick break, but before that, I want to tell you about the Law Group here in Wilmington, and remind you that when legal challenges arise, make sure you put your trust in the Law Group. Since 2003, Melissa Gott and her team of experienced attorneys have provided high-quality, affordable legal services across the eastern half of North Carolina. No matter the legal issue that you are facing, whether you're a first-time home buyer navigating a complex real estate transaction, maybe you're in a position where you need a strong criminal defense, no matter the issue, the Law Group has your back. Their dedicated team ensures your questions are answered and issues are resolved as quickly as possible. Great news, folks. They're not some big national law firm. Melissa Gott and her team live right here in southeastern North Carolina. Their office is located in downtown Wilmington, and they're just a phone call away at 910-251-6088, or you can visit them online at lawgroupnc.com. That's 910-251-6088, or online at lawgroupnc.com. It's the Law Group. Experience and dedication you can rely on. Can't thank Melissa Gott and her team enough for their continued support here of the Nick Craig Show. All right, quick break. We'll get to more of this long-form interview between JD Vance and Joe Rogan coming up as the Nick Craig Show continues streaming live this Thursday morning, YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, and available 24/7 wherever you get your podcasts. And a good Thursday to you. Welcome back to the Nick Craig Show. Thanks for spending some time here today. Don't forget that you can support the show, get access to our daily show notes, as well as our monthly hangout. That'll be coming up in the next 2 weeks as we approach the end of July. You can get access to that over at patreon.com/Nick Craig. You can support the show for as little as $5 or $10 a month if you believe that you are getting some value, want access to those daily show notes and more. Patreon.com/Nick Craig. Looking forward to chatting with everybody at our Patreon hangout coming up here in the next couple of weeks. I'm talking about an interview that took place earlier this week, was uploaded yesterday, where Vice President JD Vance on his continuing book tour sat down and did 2 hours and 53 minutes with the most popular podcaster in the United States, Joe Rogan, in an interview that has already received millions of views since it was published yesterday afternoon. And I was talking earlier about the importance of these conversations and the importance of meeting voters where they are, with the understanding, with the premise that the vast majority of the American public is not hyper involved in politics. They do not watch cable news. They do not watch a lot of broadcast television. They just don't. They find politics to be dirty and nasty and honestly really depressing and sad a lot of the times, and they're busy in their lives. And so the last thing many folks want to do after a long work day and a long day after that, getting home, trying to unwind for a couple of hours before you call it a night, the last thing that most people want to do is get entrenched in politics. And I don't fault them for that. I don't have any animosity towards those individuals. I get it. It is an exhausting thing to do. I do it all day, every day. And so sitting down with somebody like a Joe Rogan, who has, and what I would suspect to be a largely non-political audience, that is a perfect example, a perfect situation where you are talking to individuals that you otherwise would not have had the ability to do so. And that is very, very important. This is something that we saw with great success in the 2024 presidential campaign. Donald Trump and Joe Rogan went on a variety of these new media platforms, talking to people, both JD Vance and President Trump, sitting down with Joe Rogan during the 2024 campaign. Kamala Harris had the ability to sit down with Joe Rogan, but she refused to do so. Why? Because she didn't want to have this casual conversation. Her and her media people were terrified that she would get pressed on an issue. And one of the great things about somebody like Joe Rogan is he doesn't agree. He's not a ultra conservative. He's not an ultra liberal. He's got conservative takes and liberal takes. And so he pressed the vice president and the administration on a variety of topics, including the handling of the Epstein files. There was a pretty long discussion about that. There was a discussion about what's going on in Texas right now, where new Texas state law allows and puts the 10 Commandments in all public schools across the state. They disagreed, and that's okay. But see, Kamala Harris and the Democrat Party was terrified that if she sat down with Joe Rogan and was pressed on an issue like illegal immigration, which was something that she was responsible for as the border czar under Joe Biden, the president, that she would crumble under the pressure. She wouldn't be able to answer the questions. She wouldn't be able to have any sort of discussion about it, so they ran away. They decided, this is not a platform. They invited Joe Rogan to Philadelphia to set up a studio and do like a 45-minute to an hour interview, which he said, no, I'm not doing this. My guests, including the president, the vice president, some of the most successful people of our time, Elon Musk, they come to Austin, Texas. We make room. They come to Austin, Texas, and we do this interview. We do this sit down. We have this casual conversation. Kamala Harris and the Democrats refused to do that, and I think it hurt them big time during the 2024 presidential election. I would encourage you to go and listen to the entire 2 hours and 53 minutes of this. It is a very good listen and a lot of interesting insight. One of the things that I found the most interesting in the entirety of the show was when there was a lot of discussion about the war in Iran. How did we get to this point? There was a discussion over whether JD Vance fully agreed with the approach that the administration took. JD Vance stated publicly what is already known, that he didn't fully agree with how the president went about the ongoing conflict in Iran, but said, hey, Joe, this is the way this works. I provided my advice. I gave my thoughts to the president, but once he made a decision, and this was such a great line, once he made the decision, it is my responsibility to follow what the president wants to do and get the best outcome possible. I know, crazy idea. JD Vance didn't agree full-heartedly with what the administration did, but once the decision was made by the president of the United States, he said, my job is to make this as best as I can. My job is to make this deal go smoothly as possible. And the vice president talked a little bit about the coalition within the administration. I found this to be very insightful. Take a listen.
Look, the coalition that Donald Trump piloted to the 2024 election campaign, it was a landslide. We won 7 states. It was historic. Nobody, certainly no Republican, had actually led a coalition like that, at least since the days of Ronald Reagan. So like literally before I was alive. Okay. So Donald Trump wins this great coalition. And look, it's got hawks and it's got people who hate foreign wars. Okay. It's got people like you and people like Tucker. It's also got people like Mark Levin and others. Okay. I just accept that as a reality. That's part of the coalition. I don't say that anybody is welcome or unwelcome. I say that if you're willing to sort of help us, you're going to get a lot what you want. You don't get everything that you want.
What a novel concept. What a great, something I have been yelling for years. You're not going to get everything you want. Whether he talks about, oh, we've got the war hawks, these forever war peoples, we've got these no wars, no foreign conflict people. You're going to get a lot of what you want, but you're not going to get everything. What a novel concept there from the vice president.
What has really annoyed me about the hawkish side of this thing is they attack any effort to negotiate. They attack the president. They attack me personally. Donald Trump is betraying me. Well, wait a second. If you want to have like a hawkish policy towards Iran, the idea that Donald Trump has betrayed you because he's also trying to negotiate to get a good outcome for the American people is crazy. And so you've seen a lot of these people completely flip on him, and that brings me to the $300 billion point. What we did with the MOU is we actually worked not just with the Iranians, but with the Gulf Arab states.
What is the term MOU? What does it stand for?
Memorandum of Understanding. It's the basic structure that we set up for the negotiation. So what happened here is, okay, so people sort of think of the Middle East as like Iran versus Israel. I think a lot of people do. There's also a massive number of Gulf states that are really important, good allies to the United States. You know, they and Israel don't always see eye to eye, but we're obviously very close to both Israel and to the Gulf states. And the Gulf states actually came to us and said, you know what? If the Iranians are really willing to change their behavior, we'd like to invest in rebuilding their country. Now, whether they change their behavior is something that's going to be determined over the long term, right? We want to see real changes. We want to see them to stop funding terrorist organizations. And also, of course, none of that money comes from the United States. But if Iran's biggest enemies in the region are saying, we'd like to invest if they've changed their behavior, would the United States let us? Would we release the sanctions that would make it possible for the UAE and Saudi Arabia and other countries to invest in Iran? Our attitude was, well, isn't that a victory for us? If Iran's biggest enemies see that they have changed themselves so much that they're willing to invest in the Iranian economy, isn't that like the definition of a win-win?
There's a little bit from the conversation, the narrative that, of course, the mainstream media and according to what JD Vance just said, these hawks within the Trump coalition, that the United States was giving $300 billion worth of taxpayer monies to the country of Iran, which, as we discussed on this program, as you've heard from the president and now heard from the vice president, is a complete and total lie. It is a complete and total fabrication. But that has not and did not stop people from running with this narrative. No surprise those on the political left did it. But as you just heard there from JD Vance, he finds it frustrating that some of these forever war people within the coalition have decided to slam the door on the administration, slam the door on President Trump and say, well, because you're not leading us into a forever war, we're backing out. We're now going to start hammering you all over the media landscape. And it was obvious in watching this and listening to this to see JD Vance's kind of body language. He found that situation very frustrating. And I would imagine they're over here trying to broker a deal with Iran, and you're getting beat up by people that should be your allies because they're not getting 100% of what they want. And so I found that to be one of the more insightful things from JD Vance, again, in this very casual conversation that took place on this podcast. Very casual. Very sit down, which I will contend is a good thing. We are talking about a major sit down interview between the Vice President of the United States, JD Vance, with the most popular podcaster, I'd argue, in the world, Joe Rogan, on the Joe Rogan Experience, and how the Vice President and other folks within the administration that have sat down with Joe Rogan over the last year and a half, both Vance and Trump sitting down with him before the election in November of 2024, is exactly what needs to happen from the standpoint of Republicans. Most Democrats, not all, because plenty of Democrats have sat down with Joe Rogan, but most establishment Democrats would never put themselves in this situation because they're afraid of conflict. Why are they afraid of conflict? This is one of the things that you've heard me say a lot. In general, their ideas stink. They're not good. Their ideas stink. Their ideas are no good. Their ideas are largely unpopular with the vast majority of the American people. And so it's really hard for them to sit down in this kind of very casual, unscripted interview show and have a 2.5 or 3 hour conversation where they're going to be pushed. And that's one of the things that I think there's a huge disservice to the Democrat Party because the media is so friendly to them. Because the vast majority of our media apparatus will do anything in their power to cover for these people 24/7. They're not capable of legitimately explaining and arguing their ideas, right? When some mainstream Democrat gets invited to go on MSNBC or CNN, it is very rare that they're pressed on an issue. It is very rare that they actually have to answer some of these questions that I think the vast majority of the American people would like to know. Why do you think it's good, Kamala Harris, that you guys imported millions upon millions of illegal immigrants into the United States between 2020 and 2024? I think that's a fair question. And polling very clearly shows, and I think the election outcome in November of 24 very clearly showed that the vast majority of the American people did not support and did not like unchecked immigration. Had Kamala Harris sat down with Joe Rogan, which she was invited to do so, Joe Rogan said, I reached out to both political parties, both political campaigns, invited them to come to Austin. Trump and Vance took advantage of that. The Harris campaign did not, because she wouldn't have an answer for that. And unlike the rest of the friendly left-wing media, Joe Rogan is not going to give her a free pass. He is not going to ignore everything. He is not going to get a sheet of questions that he is allowed or not allowed to ask. That's not how the show works. That's not how the program is set up. And Democrats just can't function in that way. And so as I said a few minutes ago, it's almost been a disservice to the Democrat Party with their friendly media because they're never pressed on this stuff. They have never been put into a situation where they have been asked on a national, or in the case of a podcast, an international stage to legitimately answer a question. As I noted a little while ago, this entire interview, there was a lot of disagreement between JD Vance and Joe Rogan on a variety of different issues. And JD Vance handled it like a pro. Yeah, Joe, I understand what you're saying. I can see that argument. I don't agree with it, and let me tell you why. Joe Rogan would fire back and say, Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but I still don't think X, Y, and Z. JD Vance, yep, again, I think that makes sense as well. I can understand where you're coming from, but I don't think it actually plays out. And that the largest part of that came over a discussion as to whether it was a good idea for public schools in the state of Texas to start displaying the 10 Commandments in classrooms and throughout the school, which is now law in the state of Texas. And they had a full-throated debate on that. It was respectful. Nobody got nasty or hostile, but Joe Rogan expressed his concerns and issues with it. JD Vance said, I understand. I see it a different way. They talked about it for, 15 or 20 minutes, and then they moved on to the next topic. I can't envision, if I close my eyes, I can't envision a situation where a Democrat, a prominent one, somebody like a Kamala Harris in 2024, would have ever put themselves in that situation, where they ever would have knowingly sat down, not with a hostile interviewer. I would argue that Joe Rogan is not a hostile interviewer, but sit down with an interview and sit down with a topic where they can't completely control it, where it is not going to turn into an infomercial about how this individual, in the case of Kamala Harris, how great she is, how great the Democrat Party is, and how the American people need to elect them. They are terrified of being pressed. They are terrified of having to answer these questions. And so what is my big takeaway from this interview? I think it's great that people within this administration continue to take advantage of these opportunities to book these shows and to sit down and have these conversations. It's okay to get pressed on an issue. I talked about this earlier in the week when I was sitting in for Brett Winterbull, the Brett Winterbull show on WBT. We talked about this, right? With the passing, the unexpected passing of Lindsey Graham over the weekend. A lot of conservatives, a lot of Republicans making comments online that JD Vance or that Lindsey Graham was this, that, and the other, and they didn't agree with him 100% of the time, and because of that, this, that, and the other. It's fine. You don't have to agree with everybody. It's totally okay to have a disagreement. We have gotten into this very bizarre period in politics where the concept of disagreeing with somebody is somehow the end of the road. Oh, I disagree with the administration on the conflict in Iran, therefore I'm done with the entire administration. That is so incredibly stupid. And I will always go back to one of the great quotes from President Ronald Reagan about the concept of an 80% friend versus a 20% foe. The quote, as it is attributed to Ronald Reagan, is the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is a friend and an ally, not a 20% traitor. According to analysis of that, this philosophy, often referred to as the 80-20 rule, reflects Reagan's pragmatic approach to building broad coalitions and working with those in politics. It's okay to not agree 100% of the time. It's okay to agree with 70, 80, or 90% of what somebody says. I would argue that is a normal thing. You do not have to throw out the baby with the bathwater because you disagree with something. You don't have to throw out the entirety of a administration or a policy or political ideas because you have a disagreement. That is a terrible mindset to have. It is a disastrous political mindset. And it is something that you see big time now in the Democrat Party, where you've got very well-known, very prominent Democrat lawmakers that are just getting completely tossed to the side by these far-left progressive radicals, these socialists, these Marxists, the Graham Plattners of the world that jump into this situation, jump into politics with a goal of taking complete and total power. It doesn't work. It doesn't play. And so my final message to all of you is it's okay to have a disagreement. I don't, for example, agree with the administration's tariff policies. I don't necessarily agree with how the administration has continued to conduct itself as it relates to the war in Iran. That doesn't mean that I hate Donald Trump. That doesn't mean that I hate JD Vance. That doesn't mean that I hate the administration. I'm allowed to have a disagreement. I'm allowed to voice my displeasure with something. I'm allowed to look at a situation as an intelligent person and say, I see it a different way. That's totally fine. That's totally okay. It's not a negative thing. It's not. It's okay to disagree. It's okay to have a different viewpoint and a different opinion. I'd highly encourage you to spend a couple of hours and listen to this I found it very informative interview between Joe Rogan and JD Vance. You can find that on all of your favorite podcast apps. We, of course, are going to be keeping a close eye on what's coming out of the White House tonight, 9 o'clock. The president set to address the nation, talking about voter ID, voter integrity, and is set to, as he says, make a major announcement as it relates to election integrity. What exactly that looks like remains relatively unclear as of right now. I'll be watching that live this evening, and we'll have the latest stuff coming up for you live tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. right here on the Nick Craig Show. All right, that's going to do it for a Thursday edition. Thanks to the Law Group here in Wilmington for their continued support. LawGroupNC.com is their website. The Nick Craig Show streams live weekday mornings, 7 a.m., YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, available 24/7 in your favorite podcast apps, and heard weeknights, 9 to 10 on WBT Radio in Charlotte. Enjoy your Thursday. We'll do it again tomorrow morning right here on The Nick Craig Show.